Once again, I wish to thank Carol Hennigar for her contribution to today's meditation, focused solely on the 12 portraits on the balcony railing. Peter, chief among the disciples, Paul, foremost of the apostles, and Mary, mother of Jesus, with the other disciples and writers of the Gospels. Initially, 9 panels were located in the wall between the narthex and the nave. The original installations were colored glass, but they were gradually replaced by memorial windows. Renovations involved the resiting of the windows to the balcony railings with backlighting. There appears no perceptible pattern to the current order of these portraits. I would have preferred to present these personalities to you in a more logical order, but that you may more readily follow, they will be described in the order in which they currently exist. The first 7 installed were all disciples. An 8th joined them, but in the meantime, the evangelist Luke had found a place, joined later by another evangelist, Mark, bringing to completion all 4 gospel writers, since Matthew and John were also disciples. Mary, a mother of Jesus, and Paul, author of many New Testament books, whose omission would have been a major oversight, brought the total number of portraits to 12. Ignored in this gallery are 4 lesser-known disciples, to make room for these other, more significant personalities. Luke is named by Paul in his letter to Philemon, designating him a fellow worker. In the letter to the Colossians, Luke is mentioned again, and this time described as the beloved physician. In 2 Timothy, Luke is named one final time as being present with the writer of the letter. The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts were written by the same person, but neither book indicates who the author was, and there is no evidence before the end of the 2nd century that Luke was that author. But since tradition has bequeathed us no other name for the 3rd Gospel, we ascribe it to the good doctor, and in this portrait, Luke is holding a book. Luke is also holding a serpent's staff in his right hand. The presence of one serpent would mark it as the rod of Asclepius, the Greek god of healing and medicine. 2 serpents make it the staff of Hermes, the Greek messenger god, an error widespread in American iconography. 2 disciples are named James, the brother of John, son of Zebedee, and James, son of Alphaeus, called James the Younger. Presumably, the brother of John was older or taller, and therefore became known as James the Elder, or as here, the Greater. Along with his brother, James made his living by fishing. A fishing boat can be seen behind him, and in his left hand he holds a fishing net, tools of his former trade. James was the first of the disciples to be martyred. Despite his early death, later tradition had James traveling to Spain, becoming the patron saint of pilgrims, and thus is shown with a pilgrim's staff and water bottle. The name James in Hebrew is Jacob, and when rendered into Spanish, becomes Iago, thus Santiago de Compostela. According to the Synoptic Gospels, Andrew was called to be a disciple at the same time as the other fishers, Peter, James, and John. However, according to the Gospel of John, Andrew was first a disciple of John the Baptist. It was he who introduced his brother Peter to Jesus. A fishing net lies at his feet, gear from his fishing days. Later tradition has Andrew traveling about as a missionary in Greece, where he was crucified on an X-shaped cross at his own request, as he deemed himself unworthy to be crucified in the same manner as his Lord. A legend states that relics of Andrew's body were brought to County Fife in Scotland by a Northumbrian bishop who founded a cathedral on the site of what became the town of St. Andrews. Another legend claims that in thanksgiving for the victory of an army of Picts and Scots against the Angles, Andrew was appointed the patron saint of Scotland. Jude is the title of the second to last book in English translations of the New Testament, and the author claims to be a servant of Jesus Christ and brother of James. The Greek, however, reads Judas, but scholars are generally agreed that he is not the Judas, son of James, named in Luke as one of the 12 disciples. Matthew and Mark instead record the name Thaddeus in this part of their list. Consequently, like Simon Peter, this disciple is known by two names, Jude Thaddeus. According to one tradition, Jude was martyred by being beheaded in Beirut, in the Roman province of Syria, now Lebanon. The spear-pointed axe in his right hand signifies the way in which he was killed. Simon, son of Jonah, with his brother Andrew, made a living by fishing on Lake Galilee, headquartered at Capernaum. Jesus bestowed on Simon the nickname Cephas, an Aramaic word meaning rock. Paul called him by this name, but history knows him better by the Greek version, Peter. Peter was of an impetuous nature. Once, when the disciples saw Jesus walking on water, Peter, with Jesus' permission, immediately stepped out of the boat to join him, but fearing the strong wind, began to sink. It was Peter who at first refused to have his master wash his feet, then wanted his hands and head washed as well. And we well remember how Peter swore solemnly that he would die with Jesus, then denied even knowing him during his interrogation at the high priest's palace. But from that time on, Peter was as steadfast as his name implies. For the first third of the book of Acts, he is the main actor, anchoring the church around the disciples' testimony to what Jesus had said and done. Peter carried on missionary work as far afield as Asia Minor. Tradition, of course, places him in Rome, but how early and why are unknown. The tradition that he died a martyr in Rome during the reign of the Emperor Nero is better attested, but whether on a cross upside down or in the arena with lions is undetermined. The scroll in Peter's left hand acknowledges that two letters near the end of the New Testament are attributed to him. Simon Peter was, as far as we know, an uneducated Aramaic-speaking fisherman until he became a disciple as an adult. That he would be able to write excellent Greek, dealing with problems that arose long after his death, lacks credibility, and most scholars do not trust this tradition. In this window, Peter also holds a large pair of keys in his right hand. After Peter confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, Jesus declared, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." The gold key signifies that this authority reaches to heaven, and the silver key that it extends to all the faithful on earth. The sons of Zebedee were labeled by Jesus sons of thunder because they once wanted to command fire to come down and consume an unreceptive Samaritan village. It was John and Peter who were the disciples instructed by Jesus to make preparations for the Passover. And in the early chapters of Acts, John is regularly paired with Peter as the two most prominent apostles before the conversion of Paul, acknowledged by him as pillars in the church in Jerusalem. 3 letters near the end of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, and the 4th Gospel are all attributed to John. The Gospel of John never names John, but 5 times mentions a disciple whom Jesus loved. Tradition has deduced that this disciple was John. John is always portrayed as a young person, sometimes indistinguishable from a woman. He is always clad in red and green robes. He carries a book containing the large Johannine corpus of writings in the New Testament. John is depicted here also with a cup. There is a tradition, attested not earlier than the 4th century, that John was once challenged to prove that the gospel he preached was true by drinking a cup of poison. John prayed, then drank, and, unharmed, continued to preach. Were it not for his skeptical nature, Thomas would have been among the neglected disciples. He appears in every list of disciples and utters 2 statements in John. Otherwise, we know him only as the great doubter. The name Thomas in Hebrew means twin, so stated 3 times in the Gospel of John. In Gnostic circles, he was considered the twin of Jesus. By that reckoning, his father would be Joseph the carpenter. The next logical step was to assume that he too was a carpenter, and he is portrayed here holding a carpenter's square. According to more reliable accounts, the Apostle Thomas traveled to southern India to spread the gospel, and there was martyred. He was born Saul, but as a missionary throughout the Roman Empire, he adopted the Latin name Paul. He was not one of the original disciples, but he did become an apostle, the least in his own estimation, but history has judged him the foremost, a prolific writer and the greatest theologian of early Christianity. Early in his career, Paul became a fierce opponent of the new Jewish group that was claiming that a recently executed criminal was actually the expected Messiah. At some point in his campaign of extermination, he underwent a profound spiritual experience that left him intensely committed to this new doctrine. Paul always claimed that his authorization came directly from the risen Christ, who had appeared to him and commissioned him to become a missionary to the Gentiles. Over the course of 2 decades, he established churches throughout Asia Minor and Greece, eventually ending up in Rome, on his way, he had hoped, to continue his mission in Spain. In this portrayal, Paul grasps a sword in his right hand and a scroll in his left. Tradition states that Paul was martyred by beheading, the form of execution befitting a Roman citizen, the sword signifying Paul's martyrdom. The scroll is in recognition of Paul's many letters to various church communities. At one time thought to be the author of 14 of the 27 books in the New Testament, modern scholarship has cut that number in half. That still leaves us with a substantial body of literature. His first letter to the church in Thessalonica was his earliest. His letter to the churches in Rome, his last, even it written a good 10 years before the earliest of the Gospels. There are 2 Philips in the New Testament. The ministry of Philip the evangelist is recorded in the book of Acts. We are looking here, however, at Philip the disciple. In the Gospel of John, Philip was the first disciple called by Jesus. He became an eager recruiter, bringing Nathanael and some Greek inquirers to Jesus, and it was to Philip that Jesus turned to help him feed a large crowd. Later Christian traditions describe Philip as preaching in Syria, Greece, and Phrygia in Asia Minor. According to one account, Philip was martyred in the city of Hierapolis by being crucified upside down. What Philip holds in his right hand here is a pilgrim's staff, in acknowledgement of his missionary journeys over such an extensive area. Matthew is listed as a disciple in all three synoptic Gospels, but qualified as the tax collector only in the Gospel of Matthew. Only Matthew's Gospel narrates a story about Jesus calling a tax collector named Matthew to be a disciple. In Mark and Luke, the same account names the tax collector Levi, so it appears that we have another disciple with two names. It is because only the first Gospel names the former tax collector disciple Matthew that tradition settled on him as the author of that Gospel. Modern scholars think that highly unlikely, but in recognition of his reputation as the author, he is represented here with an open book. A tradition early in the 2nd century attributes the authorship of the second Gospel to John Mark, a cousin of the apostle Barnabas, whom he accompanied on a missionary journey across the island of Cyprus, along with the apostle Paul. Mark is also mentioned in the first letter of Peter. Mark himself was not recognized as an apostle, but because he is credited with writing a gospel, he is depicted here with a book and quill. Last but not least is Mary. Indeed, Mary ought to come first as the one who conceived and labored to give birth to the world its deliverer. To a Roman Catholic audience, there would be much to say about her perpetual virginity, her ascension, her position as Queen of Heaven, and her role as a mediator between petitioners and her son Jesus. Protestants are less willing to attribute such authority to one who, apart from the nativity stories in Matthew and Luke, is seldom mentioned during Jesus' ministry, although John includes her among those present at the crucifixion, and the book of Acts counts her among the post-resurrection group of followers. Mary is traditionally depicted in blue robes. The lily of the valley symbolizes the purity of the Virgin, roses her love. The cedar of Lebanon in the background expresses the majesty, the beauty, and the goodness of the Mother of Christ. Luke tells us that following the visit by the shepherds, Mary treasured all their words and pondered them in her heart. Perhaps the artist intends us to imagine her reading a record of those days. The founders of the faith that proclaims God's good news of salvation lived, preached, and died 2 millennia ago. What they founded, however, still survives today. Whenever we, who perpetuate their work, worship in this sanctuary, we behold that message directly before us, while they, whose shoulders we stand on, watch silently over us.